You have always known, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that stopped you from laughing or planning or falling in love, but somewhere in the background of your awareness, like a quiet line of code running beneath everything else, you have known that one day this ends. Someone told you when you were small. A pet stopped breathing. A grandparent didn't wake up. The adults used careful words. You nodded as if you understood. And then you went outside and kept playing. And that is the strange part. You wake up every morning as if the contract has no expiration date. You make plans for next year. You argue about small things. You save money. You imagine a future version of yourself 10, 20, 30 years from now. That is not denial. That is not ignorance. That is something far deeper. It is one of the most profound features of the human mind. For thousands of years, we have wrestled with this. In the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, a king watches his closest friend die. He refuses to let the body go. He waits days, stunned, until decay makes denial impossible. Then he runs into the wilderness, searching for immortality. He crosses oceans. He dives to the bottom of the sea for a plant that promises eternal life. He finds it, and then it is taken from him. He returns home unchanged in power, but changed in knowledge. The oldest story we possess is not about war or conquest. It is about a man who cannot accept that death is real. We have not evolved out of that struggle. Ancient civilizations built monuments not just to power, but to continuity. Philosophers tried to reason fear away. Socrates calmly told his friends that death was either dreamless sleep or a journey elsewhere. If it was sleep, there was nothing to fear. If it was a journey, there was something to explore. Logically sound, emotionally insufficient. His friends wept anyway. Because knowing something in your mind is not the same as accepting it in your bones. The first reason is structural. Your brain has never experienced non-existence. It has experienced sleep, anesthesia, distraction, but never the total absence of awareness. Try to imagine it. Not darkness, not silence, not floating in empty space. Those are still experiences. Try to imagine the complete absence of experience. You cannot. There is always a perspective left over, always an observer. A mind cannot model a world in which it is not present to model it. It is like a camera trying to photograph its own lens. Every attempt smuggles the self back in. So when you think about your own death, what actually happens? You picture scenes. A hospital room, a funeral, a final breath. You imagine yourself from the outside. The brain quietly shifts into third-person mode. It refuses to simulate first-person disappearance. It inserts a witness, a viewpoint, a remit. Because a system designed to generate experience cannot generate the absence of experience from within itself. The second reason is older than thought. It is biological. Life has been running one experiment for billions of years. Which organisms persist? The indifferent ones vanished. The cautious ones survived. The fearful ones passed on their genes. You are the descendant of an unbroken chain of beings who did not want to die. Every ancestor you have ever had, stretching back to the first self-replicating cell, successfully avoided extinction long enough to reproduce. The fear response is not a glitch. It is the very reason you are here. And evolution does not distinguish between a tiger in the grass and the abstract idea of mortality. When you are reminded of death, even subtly, the brain shifts into defense. Attention narrows. Identity strengthens. You cling a little tighter to your beliefs, your tribe, your sense of meaning. It happens below awareness. The ancient alarm system does not care that the threat is philosophical. It reacts as if something is stalking you in the dark. The third reason is about time. You experience life as a river. Moments appear, shimmer briefly, and vanish forever. Childhood feels destroyed. Yesterday feels inaccessible. The future feels like a narrowing corridor. Yet physics suggests something stranger. In the block universe, interpretation of space-time, all moments exist within a larger structure. The past does not evaporate. It is simply not where you are located. But your consciousness does not move like a camera sliding across a fixed landscape. It feels like flow. It feels like loss. And because it feels like loss, death feels like theft. Not just of future moments, but of every moment you ever had. You can practice presence. You can cultivate gratitude. You can soften anxiety. But even in the calmest meditation, you still know there will be a final experience. A last perception. A closing frame. That knowledge hums in the background. It is the asymmetry you cannot erase. The fourth reason is narrative. You are not just flesh and neurons. You are a story you have been telling since you first formed memories. You link events into arcs. You explain your past to justify your present. You imagine future chapters. Meaning depends on continuation. A story that stops mid-sentence feels wrong. Unfinished. Death is not just a biological cessation. It is an interruption. It threatens coherence. Every culture ever recorded has constructed some form of continuation beyond the grave. Different symbols, same impulse. The story must not collapse into silence. When people are reminded of mortality, they intensify their commitments. They defend their values more strongly. They invest in legacy. They create art, have children, build institutions, write books. They try to stretch the narrative beyond the boundaries of the body. It is not hypocrisy. It is narrative repair. A mind that understands itself as a story resists abrupt endings. And beneath all of this lies the deepest layer. You do not just want to survive. You want your survival to matter. If consciousness flickers out and leaves no trace, it feels as though all the striving, loving, learning, and suffering dissolves into irrelevance. The horror is not just extinction. It is insignificance. Now step back. For nearly 14 billion years, the universe expanded in silence. Stars formed, burned, and collapsed. Galaxies drifted. On one small planet orbiting one ordinary star, chemistry crossed a threshold. Matter began to replicate. Eventually, matter began to feel. And at some point, matter began to ask questions about its own ending. You are that event. Atoms arranged themselves into a system capable of worrying about atoms ceasing to be arranged that way. The universe produced a structure that resists its own impermanence. Perhaps that resistance is not a mistake. Perhaps it is the most natural thing in the cosmos. Life pushes against entropy. Consciousness pushes against oblivion. The refusal to accept death is not ignorance. It is the culmination of billions of years of persistence. You wake up each morning and live as if the story continues because every layer of your being expects continuation. Your neurons expect another firing. Your genes expect survival. Your sense of self expects another chapter. The fact that one day there will not be one does not erase the structure that insists there should be. So maybe the question is not why you cannot accept death. Maybe the question is why you think you should be able to. You are a brief configuration of cosmic material that became aware long enough to love, to fear, to imagine eternity. The ache you feel when you contemplate your own disappearance is evidence of that awareness. It is evidence that the universe, in you, briefly cared whether it continued. One day, your particular arrangement will dissolve. But for now, in this moment, consciousness is happening. Perception is happening. Meaning is happening. The river flows. The story unfolds. And inside it, a mind shaped by biology, time, and narrative insists on more. That insistence is not weakness. It is the signature of being alive. And yet we are not finished. Because everything we have explored so far still circles around the same center. The brain cannot imagine its own absence. Evolution programmed you to resist extinction. Time feels like loss. The story demands continuation. But none of that fully explains the sharp edge of the fear. None of it explains why, in quiet moments, the thought of non-existence can feel like standing at the edge of an endless drop. So we go deeper. There is a sixth layer beneath the others, and it hides in something so obvious you almost never notice it. Your entire sense of reality is built from contrast. Light only exists because there is darkness. Sound only exists because there is silence between vibrations. Pleasure only has meaning against the possibility of pain. Experience itself depends on difference. Now consider what death represents. It is not simply the end of pleasant experiences. It is the end of contrast, the end of perception, the end of differentiation. It is not another state among states. It is the removal of the stage on which states appear. Your mind, built to process contrasts, recoils from something that contains none. Every emotion you have ever felt was anchored in change. Excitement is movement towards something. Relief is the release of tension. Grief is the absence of what once was present. But death offers no movement, no release, no absence experienced by anyone who dies. It offers a conceptual blank, a silence so complete that it cannot even be compared to silence. This is not merely frightening. It is incomprehensible. There is also something else happening quietly beneath awareness. Your sense of self is not a fixed object. It is a process. Neuroscience shows that the self is distributed across networks, constantly updated, constantly reconstructed. Each memory you recall changes slightly as it is stored again. Each decision subtly reshapes your internal model. You are less like a statue and more like a whirlpool, a pattern sustained by continuous motion. But a whirlpool depends on the river. If the flow stops, the pattern disappears. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was never a solid thing to begin with. It was an event. When you contemplate death, what you are really contemplating is the end of a process. And processes do not imagine their own cessation well. A flame does not conceive of being extinguished. It simply burns until it does not. Still, you are not just a flame. You are a flame that knows it is burning. That awareness introduces a paradox. If you did not know you would die, you would not fear it. But you also would not be able to plan, to build, to cherish. Mortality awareness sharpens experience. The fact that something ends gives it urgency. A sunset is beautiful because it fades. A conversation is precious because it cannot be replayed exactly. Scarcity intensifies value. Imagine for a moment that you were guaranteed infinite time. No deadline. No expiration. Would today matter as much? Would you call the person you love if you knew you had endless tomorrows? Would you begin the book, take the risk, forgive the mistake? Or would you postpone everything indefinitely? Mortality compresses meaning. And yet, knowing this does not dissolve the fear. Because there is another layer still. A social one. You are not an isolated organism contemplating extinction in a vacuum. You are embedded in relationships. Your identity is partly constructed from the eyes of others. The way your friends laugh at your jokes. The way your family says your name. The way your absence would ripple outward. When you imagine dying, you are not only imagining your own disappearance. You are imagining the grief of those who remain. You picture empty chairs at tables, messages unsent, birthdays uncelebrated. The fear expands beyond self-preservation into empathy. It is not just, I will not exist. It is, they will hurt. And that multiplies the weight. At the same time, you are already carrying anticipatory grief for everyone you love. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that unless you die first, you will one day stand at gravesides. You will receive calls you dread. You will experience the absence of voices that once filled rooms. Part of your resistance to death is not about your own ending at all. It is about your unwillingness to accept that love guarantees loss. To love deeply is to accept vulnerability to grief. Mortality makes love both fragile and profound. There is also the illusion of control. Human beings are extraordinary at manipulating their environment. You build cities, cure diseases, send machines into space. Control expands year by year. But death remains stubbornly outside mastery. You can delay it. You can mitigate risks. You can extend lifespan. But you cannot negotiate the final contract. The mind that has learned to solve problems hates unsolvable ones. Death is the ultimate unsolvable problem. It cannot be engineered away within the current structure of biological life. And so it sits there as a boundary condition, a hard limit against infinite expansion. Limits are psychologically uncomfortable. They confine possibility. And yet without limits, structure collapses. A game without rules is not playable. A sentence without punctuation is not readable. A life without boundaries is not definable. Death is the ultimate boundary. But here is something rarely acknowledged. You have already experienced forms of death. The person you were at 5 years old no longer exists. The fears, desires, and perceptions of your teenage self are gone. Entire chapters of identity have dissolved. Friendships ended. Beliefs changed. Versions of you disappeared quietly without ceremony. And yet you did not interpret those transformations as annihilation. You interpreted them as growth. What if biological death is another transformation of perspective? Not in the mystical sense necessarily, but in the sense that what you call you was always a temporary configuration of matter and information. The atoms that form your body were once inside stars. They were once part of oceans, plants, other animals. They will move on again. The pattern that is your consciousness may end, but the components do not vanish. They rearrange. Some find comfort there. Others do not, because the pattern feels more important than the parts. The melody matters more than the individual notes. When the music stops, the instruments still exist, but the song is over. But consider this. Every song that has ever been played still exists in the structure of the universe. The vibrations traveled outward at the speed of sound, dissipating into air molecules, then into heat. The photons that reflected off your face at this moment are racing into space forever. Nothing that has happened is erased from the fabric of reality. It is transformed, diluted, spread thin across expanding space, but it is not undone. In that sense, your existence is permanently inscribed into the history of the cosmos. Every decision, every heartbeat, every word slightly altered the arrangement of matter. The universe is different because you occurred. Does that grant immortality? Not in the way the ego wants. But it reframes significance. Meaning does not require infinite duration. A spark in darkness can alter the entire pattern of shadows, even if it burns briefly. There is another uncomfortable truth. Much of the fear of death is fear of the unknown process of dying rather than non-existence itself. Pain, loss of dignity, loss of control, uncertainty about timing. Strip those away hypothetically. Imagine instantaneous, painless cessation. The terror diminishes. What remains is more abstract. It becomes philosophical rather than visceral. This distinction matters. It suggests that part of what you fear is not the absence of experience, but the transition. And transitions are always destabilizing. Birth was a transition. Adolescence was a transition. Every major change felt overwhelming at first. Death is the final transition, one we cannot rehearse. Still, beneath all explanations, there is a simple emotional core. You do not want to stop experiencing. You like being here. Even on difficult days, even in pain, there are moments of warmth, humor, connection. There is texture to being alive. To relinquish that texture feels like surrendering something irreplaceable. And it is irreplaceable. There will never be another configuration of atoms identical to you, shaped by the exact same experiences, making the exact same interpretations. When you are gone, that precise viewpoint disappears forever. That is not melodrama. It is statistical inevitability. But uniqueness does not demand permanence to matter. A snowflake melts. A wave collapses back into the ocean. A season passes. Their transience does not negate their reality. In fact, it defines it. Perhaps the deeper shift is this. Instead of asking how to accept death, ask how to relate to it differently. Not as an enemy to defeat, not as a cosmic mistake, but as a structural feature of existence. Every complex system eventually reaches entropy. Stars exhaust fuel. Galaxies collide. Even the universe itself may one day approach thermal equilibrium. You are not singled out for extinction. You participate in a universal principle. That does not make it emotionally easy, but it situates it within a larger pattern. Mortality is not a personal failure. It is a condition of emergence. And here is something quietly radical. The fact that you cannot fully accept death may be the very thing that drives civilization forward. Art, science, philosophy, architecture, music, literature, all of it can be interpreted as humanity pushing against impermanence. Building cathedrals to outlast lifetimes. Writing books to speak beyond graves. Sending probes beyond the solar system as if to whisper, "We were here." The resistance to death generates creativity. If you removed mortality awareness from humanity, you might also remove ambition, urgency, and depth. The shadow sharpens the light. So where does this leave you? Here, now, aware of your own finitude. It leaves you with a choice of orientation. You can treat death as a looming negation, draining color from experience. Or you can treat it as a frame around the painting. The frame does not diminish the artwork. It defines its boundaries. One day, There will be a last conversation, a last meal, a last glance at the sky. You do not know when. That uncertainty is part of the design. But right now, this is not that last moment. Right now, consciousness is unfolding. Thoughts are forming. Breath is moving in and out. You are a temporary process in a vast cosmos that briefly became self-aware. The fact that you struggle with mortality is evidence of that awareness. It is the cost of having a mind large enough to imagine the future and reflective enough to contemplate absence. You cannot fully accept death because the system contemplating it is built to continue. And perhaps that is enough of an explanation. The river flows. The story unfolds. The flame burns. One day it will not. But while it does, it illuminates. And illumination, however brief, changes everything.